Hello, everyone, and welcome to a brand new episode of the Jams and Tea podcast, where we spin the jams and spill the tea. And today we are coming at you with two new reviews for two new records. We are going to be talking about the latest album from pop punk luminaries, Joyce Manor, their new record, I Used to Go to This Bar, as well as the new album, first album from formerly Injury Reserve, now By Storm, their new first debut album, My Ghosts Go Ghost. That was fun to say. We're going to start off talking today about Joyce Manor. And Joyce Manor is a band that we have technically kind of talked about before, but it was in a Now segment a couple of years ago when Riley picked them for an entry on their list of favorite albums under the span of 20 minutes. And at that time, I had not heard a Joyce Manor. I didn't know what a Joyce Manor was. In fact, I'm fairly certain there's a couple of seconds where I confusingly am like, wait, Joyce Manor is a band and not a guy's name? Oh, okay. Anywho, but I was very unfamiliar with this band beforehand. I knew what to expect, but I didn't necessarily know what they were all about. So I wanted to kind of acquaint myself with them for this week. And it was actually pretty easy considering the Joyce Manor discography will, span you a cool 2 hours, even though they have half a dozen records at this point. But Joyce Manor were a band who kind of popped up in the early 2010s as part of this sort of soft pop rock, emo, pop punk revival that was sort of in the air. And the cool thing about them is that their first couple of records, this is a band who get their appeal because they really do just kind of sound like a bunch of kids in their garage making music. Like the Joyce Manor self-titled is awesome because it's like a bunch of 14-year-olds who really like shit like Husker Du decided to make, an album about their problems, and they voice very teenage concerns and very adolescent experiences, and they write about them in very interesting ways, in ways that kind of caught me off guard, particularly on their sophomore, not their sophomore album, their third album, Never Hung Over Again, that I listened to because that was the album that Riley talked about. And I discovered that I really like this band. Like, I really, really like them. Never Hung Over Again is, to put it bluntly, a fucking masterpiece. That is a punk album that has everything I value about punk music. It's noisy, it's cluttered, it's passionate, and it's also written in a way that really makes you read between the lines. You really kind of got to sift through to see what the lyricism on these albums are saying because they form a very impressionistic portrait of youth. And there's a lot of depth to mine. Like for a 20-minute album and for albums that really don't span a whole lot longer than 20 minutes, this is a band that really know what they're doing and they have a really good sense of just how to convey very complex ideas with very simple components. So I prepared myself adequately for this new record because it's the first album that they've made since 2022. So it's their first album in 4 years, and it's the longest like span of time that has been between Joyce Manor albums, which is probably, again, why I wasn't super familiar with them because they've had a couple of records that people haven't really latched onto super strongly. So I used to go to this bar, kind of sees them in a way where they feel like they're kind of trying to position themselves as a part of the next pop punk emo revival that also has been happening for a little while now, because this is an album that very much feels as though it is trying to meet the moment of being like with bands like Pup or the recent Jeff Rosenstock output or podcast favorite band the Menzingers. This is a like Joyce Manor and the Menzingers, stones throw away from each other, really. And on this record, it is very familiar looking. It's, 20-ish minutes long. We got 9 songs on here. And this is a strange album to talk about because I feel like in a lot of ways I'm still not completely with it when it comes to the narrative of this band and maybe what people expect from them. But I enjoyed this record a fair bit, but I also think it's really inconsistent, like almost on a song by song basis, because this is clearly a very different place than where Joyce Manor were 10 years ago. And that's a sign of evolution. That's a good sign. But this production on this album is so polished, like way more polished than shit on their first three records that I'm a little bit more acquainted with. Again, it sounds more like a Menzinger's record. It sounds more like a Jeff Rosenstock record. And the polish kind of extends to the mixing, it extends to the vocal style, which is kind of very yelly and kind of yelpy in the pop punk sort of tradition, but it's a little bit more clear. Everything has a lot more clarity on this record. But I won't lie. I think the biggest obstacle when it comes to enjoying this record to the fullest extent is the writing. There's not a lot of it, frankly. Like, there is a lot of song structures here that really lean on repeating choruses and repeating hooks over and over again. And these are the moments where the album loses me a little bit because they're sticky, they're fun, they sound good, I like them in the moment, but wow, do they vanish from my mind the moment that they're over. So we have songs like the opener on here, which I think is great. I Know Where Mark Chen Lives has this really throttling chorus, and I love, like, it is very lyrically repetitive. It paints the portrait of an environment. It uses all of what we know this band for in a way that feels like it all makes sense pretty well. And then we immediately go to a song like Falling Into It, which is sweet, but saccharine and repetitive, and if I'm perfectly honest, kind of boring. So, Jen, I'm not really sure with how, like, I'm not certain whether or not you even like this kind of shit, what your experience with it is. Like, I don't know if you are as well acquainted with Wonder Years core as the rest of the former podcast was, because that is very clearly what this band are aiming for is to be the Wonder Years. And I mean, admirable, but where did you find yourself with this record? Because I will admit, I would probably think a little bit less of it if I wasn't as experienced with Joyce Manor as I am now, but eh.
I mean, here, I'll spin you the portrait. I also listened to Never Hung Over Again because I was like, this band has a lot of music behind it, and a lot of these albums are really short. I should give at least one of the other records a try, so I'll go with the one that Riley recommended, and I ended up really liking Never Hung Over Again. So I was geared up to really enjoy this, but I just kept running into songs that gave really diminishing returns. Sadly, I think a lot of these are just kind of missing some essential component that's going to take it over the line for me into being like a really memorable pop punk song that's going to stick with me. Like the opener, which, like you said, has a good groove, has a nice chorus, has good vocal lines,
Mhm.
but the second verse is very standard, and then they just do the chorus again, and then the song is over. And there's a lot of moments like that where I like the idea of a song's potential based on some of the bass components, but when I look at it as a whole and look at it as it's being presented, I don't always have a whole lot to hold on to. And yeah, it's also very inconsistent on a song-to-song basis. I would agree. The move from I Know Where Mark Chen Lives to Falling Into It suggests a really different kind of sonic environment. And frankly, this song just has this sickly synth tone that after watching all of Stranger Things, I just wanted to flee from. Uh, and
Understandable.
but I just kept having little hiccups like that with this, where I'm like, I could get into it if I had a little bit more of this or a little bit less of this. Like I once I got what was going on, I enjoyed the song conceit of All My Friends Are So Depressed,
Hmm.
where the nonsense lyrics of the verses are a metatextual element when the chorus is addressing being too faded or distracted to properly sing the words to a song that you're trying to remember, which is a pretty interesting idea. But the first time you're listening to it, the guy just sounds like he's saying gibberish and you're not quite sure what's going on. And it's little things like that where I'm just like, I would enjoy this song more if you set up the linguistic conceit first and then did it a little bit and then did the punchline. I don't know. And then the title track, I used to go to this bar, is where this kind of comes together for me because this is primo back of the bar, tiny stage, live show, jam track material. And I just want that chorus to have a little bit more to it. I want that main vocal melody to have a little bit more complexity to it. This whole album feels a little bit too keep it simple, stupid.
Yeah.
It's a little bit too far in that direction, whereas Never Hungover Again has this verve to its minimalism and to its more abrasive elements.
Oh yeah.
This has a little bit less of that spontaneity feeling inspiring, and here that spontaneity feels more like a limitation, and that some of these songs could have used a little bit more time to become more complex, more interesting, more thoughtful, and congeal better from a song to song basis to make this a more consistent track list. I will say, I did enjoy the second half of this album a whole lot more than the first. The Opossum has
Mm.
this really upbeat verve to it that I really enjoy. And Well, Don't It Seem Like You've Been Here Before is a really funny ballad about
Yeah.
finally succumbing to terminal illness after years of struggle. But again, with that
Oof.
kind of energy of this back of the bar rager track, which I think is a really interesting way to kind of portray this perspective and this experience. So don't get me wrong, there's plenty to enjoy about this Joyce Manor record, but I got a lot more out of Never Hungover Again. But this got me more interested in learning more about the band and what they do. So I will say this is not a great entry point into Joyce Manor. Don't
No.
do that. But for me, it was interesting to start from here and learn more about what this band is capable of. So I enjoyed the experience of listening to this album, but overall, I find it mostly unremarkable.
I'm in a very similar place, and I think that a lot of it has to do with, honestly, the sound, because the sound of this album is a huge double-edged sword for me, because on the one hand, I think the polished production suits Joyce Manor in a way that I probably wouldn't have predicted if I had only just listened to their first couple of albums and then had actually been anticipating this in the rollout for it. But what kind of frustrates me about it is that Joyce Manor's production has always been incredibly dynamic. Like on Never Hungover Again, there is a lot of instrumental variety that you really wouldn't expect from an album that, like, you listen to a couple seconds from one song and you're like, oh yeah, big thrashy punk band of young people singing about being young. Gotcha. Okay, cool. But the thing is that I think about that album, I think about Never Hungover Again, and I think about a song like the second song, Falling in Love Again, which is, oh man, what a fucking tune that is.
Brilliant.
But I think about the production choices of that song and how just the application of a little bit of reverb on those chorus lines feels like you are looking at God when you listen to this song. It's so wonderful. And it's just a very nice, skillful choice. They know when to apply specific effects, when to apply specific things, and they don't do it in ways that make you feel like it's garish or even like super obvious. Like there will be little like synth lines and bubbly little leads on the old records, and you almost can't even hear them, but that's sort of the appeal of them, is that a lot of the polish is being actively smothered by how angsty and noisy the rest of the band is. And this new production, again, some of these synth tones on this album sound absolutely gorgeous. I love them in isolation, but they give a uniformity to this album that sounds good, but also gives them less opportunities to make these songs more special. Like that first song, again, the I Know Where Mark Chen Lives, kind of feels like the only moment where they still feel like they've got it when it comes to this aspect of the band. I think about the moment where it kind of everything sort of drops out and it sounds like the lead singer is basically performing this in a bar, which, very Spanish love songs. Well, another band I thought about a lot when listening to this. And I couldn't help but be like, I like this because I like this, but I'm also keenly aware of the reasons why I don't like this as much as everything else in this particular area, in this particular venue. And, you've got those bands that really speak strongly to your emotions, that speak strongly to the moment politically or, whatever it is that they're doing at the time. And this kind of impressionistic approach that Joyce Manor are doing on here feels kind of one foot in and one foot out. It feels like they're trying to kind of make their songwriting a little bit easier to comprehend to most, but in that respect, it also means that it's way less, I guess, aerodynamically designed than the rest of these bands. Like they know what they're doing and they attack it acutely. Where this just kind of feels like, most pop punk bands like this that I'm talking about, they are sniper rifles. This is a sawed-off shotgun. It is everything everywhere all at once. And as a result, it doesn't do any one thing hugely well. And like I enjoy it, it's fine, but I would be kidding myself if I wanted to recommend this over again the first three Joyce Manor albums, which I just think are all stronger. So for another time, I'm gonna have to do a thing where I give a thumbs down to an album I kind of like. I just can't really recommend it, you know?
Yeah, I feel the exact same way. Like I did. There was never a moment where I was like, oh, I'm actively disliking this. I just kind of always wanted a little bit more. And
Hmm.
I can't, in good conscience, recommend something that leaves me feeling that way at the end of it.
I completely agree with you. And on the other side of the spectrum, wow, we are really rounding out the range that we've got when it comes to releases that we're covering. But we've also got on the dock for today the latest album from By Storm. And By Storm, as mentioned in the intro, are the now two remaining members of formerly Injury Reserve. And Injury Reserve were a band that really felt a part of a specific moment in hip hop in the late 2010s where they had some mixtapes and just lots of underground stuff that, the blog sphere and critics were just losing their minds over. And they got big real fast because of this movement. Because, I mean, honestly, I lump in Injury Reserve with the Brockhampton moment as being like these really colorful productions and like just these guys who seem like they're coming into the industry from an outside perspective and really, really want to change the game. Like it does feel like these guys were legitimate genre disruptors who came in and their stated goal was to be creative, to be interesting, to get people to like them in that way. And once they dropped the self-titled, it felt like Injury Reserve kind of really had made it. Like they had come a long way since those mixtapes. They were working with bigger names. They were, able to use production that sounded better and that was able to sort of, meet their rising ambition. And then when one of their members tragically passed, and then by the time we got to Phoenix, which we covered on this show, Injury Reserve became very, very different. So, Jen, I'm going to turn it over to you because I have long followed Injury Reserve's career and have been a fan of them since a long time before by the time I get to Phoenix. But I do feel like Injury Reserve to me, that's a Jen band. I don't know why, but it feels
You're
like it is.
you're absolutely right because okay, Injury Reserve was my like early Odd Future. I didn't keep up with the Odd Future guys and their early stuff when that was going on, but when Injury Reserve was coming up, that's where I was. I love all the records, man. I love Life in the Dentist Office. I love Floss. I love the self-titled. By the time I get to Phoenix is still in my top 3 albums of the decade thus far. By the time I get to Phoenix is one of the most seminal works of a very specific kind of album, which is the like coming back from the loss of a member record.
Yep.
You see that with Metallica on Injustice for All, for example. By the Time I Get to Phoenix is another example of that. But it was unsure at the time when By the Time I Get to Phoenix was coming out if this was really going to be the end for Injury Reserve. There were no definitive statements made in any of the lyricism or anything. And so for a while we thought, Injury Reserve could go on without Grogs, but it seems that the changing of the name to By Storm and the starting of this kind of new project represents a different kind of artistic sentiment from Richie with the T, now the solo MC, and the producer Parker Corey.
Mhm.
This, and I don't know, maybe this album will end up being a flash in the pan for what By Storm ends up becoming. But right now, this is a project that is, for me, defined by the act of mourning. And this
Yeah.
album is often defined by the act of mourning what once was, both the loss of Grogs, but also for Richie. There's a lot of thematic through lines on this album about getting a little bit older
Mhm.
and having interests and drives change in real time. Because we're not just dealing with the loss of Grogs, we're dealing with now, on the full context of the record, Richie talking in mixed tense about becoming a father, being a father, and the responsibilities that that's bringing into his life, his juggling of wanting to continue making art with wanting to provide for himself and his family, and just the willingness to make art to begin with is a lot of what drives My Ghosts Go Ghost. But it starts with this interesting turn because I really wasn't sure what to expect. Because after Double Trio and Zigzag, I committed to not listening to any more of the singles until the project was finished because they were all being released very sporadically in a way that to me rang as a little bit panicked and a little bit shaky. Like we went over a year in between singles leading up to this project, which made it seem like we weren't really sure what kind of shape this was going to take. And so I wanted to
Mhm.
wait until I could have the full album context for My Ghosts Go Ghost. But what I ended up getting here was an album that combines Injury Reserve's old glitchy hip hop stylings, especially on their self-titled album, with a kind of bedroom hip hop approach. There's a lot of low key instrumentation on this and quiet vocals. And I mean, it starts with a moment of straightforward acoustic balladry on Can I Have You for Myself? This kind of lovesick ballad of kind of mourning now that the baby is coming, the fact that you'll
Mhm.
never get to like love your romantic partner the same way again because your priorities are about to completely change and the state of mind that you're going to be in when you become a parent is completely different than you were when you weren't. But this lyric on this first track gave me the idea that this album was going to be a little bit more complicated than I expected, which is that don't want to share all the sad songs when it's sad out too. And so for me, this album became more so about the resilience that Richie and Parker are feeling about making art, not just to mourn, but to preserve the legacy of the people that they used to be.
Mhm.
This album for me serves as a big transition point for these two artists and them exploring the idea that it is a transition point for them. Like the song Dead Weight, where, and this is interesting because we have a lot of songs on Injury Reserve's catalog where they're talking about their bodies and their body images. Knees hurt when I grow. And they talk,
Yeah.
Groggs has so many verses where he's talking about like his drinking problems and needing to lose weight and wanting to get in shape so he can like be a better rapper and be a better guy and do all that. And Deadweight kind of continues this idea by kind of visualizing Richie's peers, telling him that he might want to make some big physical change, do something different with his hair is what the song ends up being about. Cutting off that dead weight, that's what the titular dead weight ends up being. But then it ultimately signifying, Richie being the same at the end of the day because he wants to hold on to some of his past self. He wants to hold on to what he looked like and what he felt like when he was working with Groggs. And this also comes after Richie's solo album, which I found interesting and ultimately kind of a springboard for this, but you really feel the anxiety that Richie is clearly experiencing with wanting to keep going come through a lot more on that solo album. Which the name is escaping me.
I completely forgot that he dropped that, honestly. But as somebody who did not tune into that, you do think there is kind of a lineage that that album kind of belongs to, because like this is already very much in dialogue with By the Time I Get to Phoenix. So it sort of feels like perhaps those two records explain what a huge southpaw this album ends up being.
Yeah, and Triple Digits is the name of Richie's solo album that came out not last year, 2024. Dang it, I'm still acting like it's 2025. Triple Digits was actually mostly produced by Richie himself, which I think is interesting. Parker Corey comes in on a couple of tracks towards the end, and there's a dedication to him towards the end as well. And so I think Richie making this and then coming back with My Ghost Go Ghost and fully embracing this collaboration is a sign that there's more kind of left in the tank that he wants to explore. And there's a little bit of a fuck you to the fans attitude in that as well, where by the time we get to the song Grapefruit, this is a beautiful song
Yeah.
about art making you vulnerable and embracing the possibility of art making you vulnerable
Hmm.
and kind of eschewing the frustrations of the industry to continue kind of doing the thing that makes you happy. You know, leave it on the table so everyone can eat is, I think, also a key lyric on this record. And it ultimately ends up becoming an exploration of Richie's own kind of fugue state that he's been in likely since Groggs' passing that ultimately ends on a resolution that there's just something in him that's going to keep moving forward and going to be compelled to keep making stuff and keep making art and kind of embrace the verve of the creative spirit. And it's in those moments where the album becomes its brightest and its most optimistic that By Storm really proves itself as separating the ethos of itself as a project from what By the Time I Get to Phoenix was getting at, where the, music video for the song By Storm that ends By the Time I Get to Phoenix ends on Richie falling asleep in bed. And this record feels like waking up from that dream, whatever the dream was, and realizing that you've still gotta go forward and live the life and like get out there and do what you got to do, do the DoorDash and, and
Hmm.
yeah, because that's what he talks about. He talked about doing DoorDash in between making beats just to like have a little money on the side. And I've always really admired Richie's spirit as like a clearly from bottom up kind of artist. And there's
Yeah.
even stuff on here that feels like very much them extrapolating stuff that they were doing before on old Injury Reserve records and trying to patch them up a little bit and make them better. Like, and that comes on the optimistic parts of the record too. Like, And I Dance has this
Ooh.
moment where these two vocal lines, these kind of two different choruses are overlapping with each other in a way that's a bit messy and in a way that embraces the kind of different stages of production, the different shapes and the different soundscapes that the song has been playing with. But then I remembered, oh yeah, this is that part on S on Your Chest that I don't like because it goes on too long and the sounds all kind of overlap on each other a little bit too much. They did that moment from S on Your Chest, but they fixed it and
Yeah.
they made it a lot better. And they embrace a lot more of a just kind of wild, loose production style that's they were initially trying to get at with some of those longer, more unkempt tracks on the old mixtapes. But now I feel like this has kind of given them this freedom to make something a bit more avant-garde, to make something a bit more challenging, make something that isn't just a traditional hip hop record, even though there's a lot of great, traditional hip hop East Coast tributes on this album as well. So there's a lot of shapes and forms on My Ghosts Go Ghosts. But what did you think of this?
I think that if you told me after the Injury Reserve self-titled drop and you gave me this album and you gave me a song like Double Trio 2 or And I Dance or The Closer, and you would be like, these are the same guys that made Jailbreak the Tesla, I would probably be like, well, first of all, no. Second of all, what the fuck happened? And, well, the answer to that would be a lot. And getting on this album's wavelength, I will not lie, was very difficult because this is such a thorny album. And a lot of ways it echoes the thorniness of By the Time I Get to Phoenix. And in fact, I would say that this is a more obtuse record than that. And notably, By the Time I Get to Phoenix was an album that like I know that Riley really struggled with that record because of its obtuseness and how like coming back to it, he kind of felt like it got a little bit of diminishing returns. I kind of felt the opposite way, but at the same time, there were so many things that I found really compelling about that album and the way that they were writing. And I was like, well, I just wonder if they're going to keep making music, how does this progress? Because you're right, that by the time I get to Phoenix, I think of that album and I put that alongside, and Justice for All is a great example. I also put it alongside Black Star as an album that like you listen to it and once you process like what it's about, you're like, oh, I do kind of feel like I'm connecting with whatever the spiritual equivalent of this artist is right now in a way that's like kind of uncomfortable and strange. Like there's moments on By the Time I Get to Phoenix that like stuff I still think about. Like I was thinking about it like this week a lot in that how there's this concept on that record of in the social media age, if
Oh,
someone dies, the algorithms that are in place online and stuff essentially keep a version of that person alive for a like a period of time until their accounts or whatever like stagnate, and how that becomes a part of the grieving process. And I found that to be like, again, that's something that's been on my mind a lot. And you don't even have to necessarily experience death to know what that feels like. If you lose touch with friends, or just you don't see people anymore, if you're not friends with people anymore, they still exist in your sphere. And I feel like that was a really poignant part of By the Time I Get to Phoenix, which is why that album was such a success, is that like that pivot shouldn't make sense and it shouldn't have gotten the attention that it did. And I don't say that because I don't like it. I love that album. I'm just saying, again, Jailbreak the Tesla by Storm, these two things having the same overlapping fan base does not make sense. And yet here we are. And when they talked about things like that, I wondered like, will those thoughts, those feelings, will they be carried forward to this next project? And the sense that like, is that album the way that it is because of Grog's death? And are we going to see like a soft reset afterwards? And By Storm says, fuck no, absolutely not. We're going further. And all my love to this approach, because it's the exact approach that I respect the most and think is the most commendable route, even though, if you stopped making music after this, like I get it. Like I understand it's difficult, especially when you consider again how he takes those themes forward. Because on this album, on songs like Grapefruit and even songs like In My Town, which is such a hazy, strange recollection of one's surroundings and how like just nebulous the entire world begins to feel around you in this particular circumstance. And there kind of comes a point where he starts talking about like the idea of not wanting to stop grieving someone because the fans of that person, like you have the closest version of that person within you. And if you let them go, you are essentially depriving everyone else of that version of that person. And I
yeah,
was I was so struck by that.
a very important selection of pronouns happens on the line. If I shed it, they forget him, not
Mm.
forget it either
Oh,
way.
that's the line of the album to me, where it's just like you don't feel a sense of ownership over your own friendship with someone or just a person in general because of the way you interact with music and fandom and all of that stuff. It's a really fascinating concept, and like I completely understand why that line of thinking came to him, just because I don't know, I would probably feel somewhat similarly of just like, if I move on, I'm moving on for everyone. And
And you
it's
got to
like
think
there's
as well, Injury Reserve does a whole tour for By the Time I Get to Phoenix anyway,
Mhm.
which becomes for the fan base like an act of public mourning. Like I saw videos when that tour was coming out of people like screaming the chorus of Knees and weeping. Like it was. an intense experience to even just see secondhand through somebody's cell phone footage. And I have to imagine that that experience inspired a lot of this particular element of this album's songwriting.
Oh, absolutely. And it explains why all of it is so esoteric and strange because, like, when you listen to this record, I mean, honestly, the thing I thought of the most was clipping. I was just like, these are guys who clearly also love like Philip Glass. They love the idea of sound design as beats. Like, this album is the closest I have felt to an album recreating Splendor and Misery, sonically speaking,
Mm.
because of how creaky and strange and like again that sort of those sort of plucked acoustic moments like this starts out in, and then it can descend into maximalist mania like on this kind of second half of the record where a lot of the songs are a little bit more, the BPM of this record escalates considerably. But even then, structurally speaking, these songs just kind of dissolve in and out of each other. And the delivery of the flows and the rapping on here is like right out of the drumless playbook. Like, dude sounds like a hop, skip, and a jump away from Earl's Sweatshirt across this entire record, pretty much. And that kind of feeling of mourning, it's like this album is basically like when this happens to an artist, when they're presented with a fork in the road, like a member dies or they make an album about losing someone vital to the creative process, and then you keep going. This is an album about what happens when your grief extends beyond the grief album. Like, you get one record to be like publicly acceptable for you to mourn your friend in your art, and then everybody does kind of expect you to have a return to form or to do something else. And it's like this album is basically them going, dude, I'm not over it. I'm not. Like, he's clearly like, I'm glad that, we're getting moments of him, talking about fatherhood and moving on with a relationship. Like, I'm very, very happy that they are able to still make these developments in their life after losing someone so pivotal to it. But at the same time, they are very much like, no, this is not, I'm not done with this yet. And dealing with it in that way is such a, I don't know, I kind of want to call what Injury Reserve have done here, well, Injury Reserve, what Bystorm, what everyone involved in this project have done, I want to call it brave. Because, again, that Injury Reserve self-titled, it was such a commercial arrival, and then to suffer that loss and immediately be like, not only are we going to make our music inherently a lot more emotionally complex because of all of this, we're also going to make it way fucking weirder. We're going to make it feel as thorny as the writing is. And they've just continued to keep upping the ante. They don't feel the need to concede. They just want to do what they want to do, and I really admire and respect it. And that I feel like that attitude led me to push through this because I won't lie, when I first listened to this album, I had no fucking idea what to make of it. Like, I listened to it and I was like, this is a fascinating record. There are several moments on here that I think are deeply commanding that I just, I have to just stop and pay attention to and applaud. But I also like the way that it all comes together. I have no fucking idea. And the more I listened to it, the more I came to the conclusion that it doesn't really all fit together, and that's kind of it. Like, there is no real resolution on here because there is no resolution for the guys. Like, they do not know their next definitive step. They don't know where they're going after this necessarily. And I hope that this ends up being a stepping stone for them, and allows them to be able to continue, because I feel like this progression could eventually yield something legitimately form challenging, because these last two albums have been. I feel like they have challenged what our perception of commercial hip hop can even be at this point. And that's fantastic. But it leads to the first listen and second listen of these albums just being like, what? But the more I've been able to kind of take and process this, the more I've been able to appreciate and even love what they're doing on here, to the point where I think this is a great record. I don't foresee it being like album of the year material for me, but at the same time, those words just left my mouth and I'm like, I don't know about that. Maybe in like 2 weeks, if I keep listening to this, it could. Because again, I liked this album not just more with every listen, but considerably more. I went from like, oh, this is an like a really cool experiment, and I feel like a lot of the writing is cool, but I don't know if it coheres for me. And now I'm just kind of on this level of like, I just want to keep listening to this. I just want to keep discovering what is in between the strange folds of the writing here because it truly is something that I think is worth applauding. And I'm glad that the internet at large seems to be responding to it quite well because again, you don't get guys taking swings like this that are both as creative and as earnest and have everyone just be like, "Oh, yes, more of this." Like that happens so rarely. So like this does kind of feel like a moment and I'm really enjoying living in it as much as
Yeah.
this album makes me feel really bad because it's not a feel good album.
Here's my one thing that I want to hold on to though with this record in specific is that this is an album that gets playful about
It does, yeah.
how it gets playful about the struggle in a lot of
Hmm.
ways. Just like in a lot of Richie's vocal licks and in a lot of the way that the album, yeah, increases in tempo as it goes through. It gets more and more playful about embracing the kind of process of grief and being able to hold on to something in a substantial, healthy way that kind of drives you forward while still being a reminder of this tragedy that you've been through. But by the time we get to And I Dance and GGG, it's not all smiles, but there's laughter amidst the grieving process
Hmm.
that I really wasn't expecting, even after listening to like the original double trio all the way back in 2023, which feels like so long ago for this band. But this is an album about recognizing that it's not all dead weight. I really keep coming back to that
Great
song as
line.
being the thing to linger with, is that it's not all dead weight and you can carry it with you and still like be on the other side of it and be healthy. Like an act of remembrance is not a sign of unhealthy attachment. And this album embraces that, where by the time I get to Phoenix, fully embraces the idea that this is a messy, abrasive grieving process.
Yeah.
This is a copacetic grieving process for the reality that this band is now living in.
I feel like if I take anything away from this album as a progression from by the time I get to Phoenix, it's really that nobody is ever really done grieving somebody. Like, in 30 years from now, you're gonna remember the people that you lost 30 years prior, and you're gonna be sad about it because that's natural. That's how people work. Like, it can get easier, but it's not going to go away. So, the progression of this and eventually getting to a point where, things are a little bit more nuanced, things are a little bit less, explicitly emotionally heavy and the worries of fatherhood and the modern world are still weighing down on you, but it's like again the notion that it's not all bad and that there is still a sunrise ahead of you, and it's doing that without being pithy or being like or condescending you and just being like there's still hope at the end of the day. Like that kind of stuff can come across as kind of flippant and just sort of, just an aphorism that doesn't hold much weight. But when you go along the journey with these guys and you really digest what they're saying, it's really that they are teaching the listener how to grieve and why grieving is good. And we're living in this empathy starved reality that we currently inhabit. So it's kind of important that people are still pushing the notion that, hey, don't shove all those negative feelings out of your brain. You probably should process them so that you can get to a point where you can, like, grief is like an open wound. You have to get to the point where those wounds become scars. And if you push everything out, the wound is just going to stay there. So, that's the dichotomy to me. By the time I get to Phoenix is an album about wounds, this is an album about scars.
Absolutely. That
Me
is
in my head
beautiful.
writing that line. This is the fucking fire,
The
fucking
little
feather,
fire
fucking
gif.
gif.
Ooh.
I'm such a fucking idiot.
Much love to Storm and what they will do
Much.
next. Please go check out My Ghosts Go Ghost. Absolute thumbs up from me on
I
this
I
record.
I would anticipate seeing this in our favorite records of the year video when we come around to it, just because in the months to come, I'm all again like just talking about it, I already feel the pull to go back and listen to this. So it's a grower, but it is very worthwhile in terms of sifting through.
Mhm.
Absolutely.
The initial impact event that is listening to By the Time I Get to Phoenix, you're not going to get that here, but it's a grower in the same way that I experienced that album as well.
100%. I really, this is maybe my strongest thumbs up of the year so far. Like, I think that in terms of things we've covered, Zach Bryan is still pretty much holding the torch of my favorite record release this year so far. But in terms of albums I want people to listen to and engage with, this is at the top of that list. Strongly, strongly. So that is going to be it for new release reviews for this week. If you've got any new music that you are spinning and want to talk about, please talk about it in the comments below. Maybe we'll even cover it here on the show. And as always, everyone, rock over London, rock on Chicago, the Washington Post. Democracy dies in darkness.
Rest in peace.